Hi, today we're making a very easy quilt using 5-inch squares. You can use 2 charm packs to make this project, or you can use yardage and cut 5-inch squares, or a combination of the two. To get started, you'll need to gather 66 squares, and of the 66 squares, you'll need 11 of them to be unique, different, or special. We're going to arrange these 66 squares so that there's 6 across and 11 down. As you can see in this layout, I've left some blocks out. These blocks are going to be for our specialty squares. So I've left the first block of the first row out, the second block of the second row out, the third block of the third row out, and so on. And in these spaces, you're going to put a block, a 5-inch square, that is different than the rest of your quilt, something that's going to stand out and draw your eye. Once you've decided on your layout, we're going to start adding sashing, and we're going to cut 2-inch strips out of a background fabric. In my quilt, I'm using black, and I've purchased 1.5 yards of fabric for this. There are 2 ways you can add this sashing. You can cut your 2-inch strips into 5-inch lengths and sew a piece of that to the right side of every one of these squares. Or you can leave the 2-inch strips whole into 40-inch lengths and chain piece your 5-inch squares. And this is my preferred method. So here I've left my 2-inch strips full length, the width of the fabric, and I'm just putting down my squares, and you kind of have to put them upside down to get them right, because you want to sew the black strip onto the right side of each one of your 5-inch squares. Once I've sewn the 5-inch squares to the 2-inch strip, I'll need to cut them apart. So here in this video, I'm showing that I've used a 1/4-inch seam. I have them all stitched down, and then I'm going to cut them apart. When you cut these apart, you just want to line up your ruler with the side of your square to cut that off. And if you've placed the squares close together, you're going to have very little wasted fabric when you get done with these. As you're working through the squares, you just want to make sure that if you have directional fabric, you are sewing this piece of sashing onto the right side of each square. On this one I'm showing in the video, it's not directional, so it doesn't matter, but you just need to keep an eye on that if you are working with directional fabric. Here you can see the specialty square that I've chosen for my quilt, and I've made 11 of these. And now I need to join, since I've finished the sashing, I have that sewn to the right side of every block, I need to sew these together in order. And you can sew these together horizontally by matching up the seams and continuing across your quilt. But for me, this was not the quickest method or the quickest way to do this, so I'll show you the way that I did it. But basically, once you have the sashing sewn on to the right side of every square, you're going to start sewing your rows together. To sew these together quickly, I sew these together, I chain piece them in columns. So you want to sew them together into rows, so across. But it was easier for me to stack them vertically into columns to chain piece them together. So I laid them out on my floor, and I actually folded column 2 squares on top of column 1 squares, and then I sewed down the right side, chain piecing this, and then they stayed attached and in order. I continued this across the quilt, so I took column 4 and put that right side together on top of column 3 squares, and I stacked them. I took them to my sewing machine and I sewed down the right side of all of those squares, and then I moved outward to column 5. I put column 6 on top of column 5, and then I sewed them all together so that they were attached and in order, and it was quicker to do this. From here, I laid them out on the floor again, and I folded column 3 and 4 back onto column 1 and 2, and then I sewed the right sides together. You're actually sewing column 2 and 3 together, and then you'll have 4 of them sewed together at one time. Once you've done that, you'll just need to go back and sew column 4 and 5 together, and then you'll be finished with sewing across the rows. Once you've sewn your rows together, you're going to add a piece of sashing to the bottom of each row, and then we will sew these all together. When I was sewing my sashing to my rows, I actually sewed it so that the sashing was on the bottom and the row was on top when it went through my sewing machine. This way I could see all the seam allowances and I could make sure that I sewed them in the direction that I wanted them to go to. For this quilt, since I had black sashing, I pressed all my seam allowances towards the sashing. If you were going to use white sashing, you might want to press all your seam allowances towards your squares. Once you've sewed your sashing on, you'll have some trimming to do. From here, we're just going to continue on with sewing our sashing on, and we'll need to sew a piece of sashing to the top of row 1. Then we'll need to sew two 2-inch strips together so that we have a long enough piece to sew a piece of sashing to the left side of the quilt. From here, it's all about borders, putting borders on this quilt, and that's up to you. You can make them as big or as small as you like. I auditioned several fabrics before I decided what I wanted to do, and I also considered what I had on hand so that I wouldn't have to go out and buy more fabric. I finally decided to do this border arrangement. I really wanted to use the striped fabric that I showed you in a previous clip, but I just couldn't get it to work out the way I wanted it to. So I ended up doing the beige fabric, which was a 3.5-inch strip. Then I went to the orange fabric, which was a 2-inch strip. And then when I went out to the green ghost were 6-inch strips of fabric. I like the way it turned out. I'm really happy with this. I made this quilt for my daughter. She picked out all the fabric and she picked out the pattern that we used. We kind of came up with that together. So in the end, I'm really happy with the way this turned out. I really think you could use it for any kind of novelty fabric that you wanted and have a perfectly lovely quilt. If you've been wondering about this little pumpkin block that I use for my specialty block, I have instructions for you. I really left it to last because you can make this quilt with any novelty fabric and put whatever you want in for your 11 specialty blocks. If you were doing a Christmas block, you could do some type of Christmas stocking or Christmas star. Really, this quilt lends well to whatever you want to do. If you are going to do a little fall quilt, this pumpkin is quite cute and it's really not that difficult to do. For this pumpkin block, you're going to need a 1/4 yard of orange fabric for your pumpkin, and you can use a fat quarter or a 1/4 yard. Either one will work. You'll have enough fabric. You will also need some scrap fabric for a leaf, some scrap fabric for a stem, and then you'll need a little bit of your background fabric, which is the black fabric that I'm showing here. To make the shape of the pumpkin, you're going to take 4 1.5-inch squares, the fabric that's your background fabric. You're going to place one on each corner of the pumpkin, and then you're going to sew diagonally across this background square from point to point. And I have actually marked mine on the black, but you can't see it, but I have a little clip of what it looks like on lighter fabric. Once you have sewed your squares onto your orange fabric, you're going to trim with approximately a 1/4 inch seam. You're going to trim that off, and then you're going to iron your background fabric out. For most of the seams in this little pumpkin, I have ironed them open just to minimize the thickness and to get this to lay flatter. When we get to the stem, the seams are going to be iron towards the stem, but I'll let you know when we get there. But for most of the seams, you'll need to iron them open. To make the leaf for your pumpkin, you're going to need a piece of fabric that is 1.5 by 2.25 inches long. That's for your leaf. And then you're going to need 2 squares from your background fabric that are 1-inch squares. And you're just going to snowball 2 corners on this green fabric that are parallel to each other. So the same technique in the pumpkin of doing the snowball technique. You're just going to draw a diagonal line and sew across it, and then you're going to trim and press your seams open. The next step is to sew on your little bit of stem onto this leaf, and you want to make sure that the leaf is laying in the direction that I'm showing here in the video. And then you're going to take a 1-inch square of your stem fabric and you're going to snowball that corner as well. Just sew on the diagonal line and do a little snowball corner. When you finish snowballing that corner, you'll just need to trim that fabric, and then you'll need to press all of your seams open.
The next step is to take a strip of your background fabric, and that strip's going to be 1.5 inches by 2.25 inches, and then you're going to sew on a piece of your stem, a 1-inch square of your stem fabric. You're going to snowball that one corner of that black background strip. Once you've sewn that stem piece on, you'll trim the extra fabric off and you'll press the snowball corner out, and then you'll press your seams open for this seam. Now we're pretty much ready to sew the top of our pumpkin together. We just need a stem piece, and the stem piece is going to be 1.5 inches by 1.75 inches. And you're just going to sew these 3 pieces together, and then when you're finished, you're going to press the seam allowance towards the stem because that's the way they kind of want to lay, and it will reduce some of the bulk in this area. So now that we have the top of our pumpkin sewn together, we can sew that onto our pumpkin. And when we sew that onto the pumpkin, you want to have the smaller piece of pieced fabric on the top. So you want to have the leaf part on top. And I would just suggest sewing from the leaf towards the other side. That way you can see your seams. There's a lot of them, and you'll be able to make sure that you sew them in the direction that you want to sew them. And then if you have any excess fabric, you can trim on the opposite side than your leaf. Then you're not taking anything away from your leaf. If you wanted to make this pumpkin just a little bit easier, you could avoid snowballing the corners of the pumpkin stem. My daughter didn't like this version. She said it looks like a stick coming out of the pumpkin, but I actually liked it. It was easier, and it cut out the steps of making the little snowball corners with the stem. But you can do whatever version you want. When you finish this pumpkin, it is quite cute, and it should come out to be a 5-inch square. I hope you'll try this quilt. It was really fun and quick and easy to make, and you really can make it your own by choosing your fabric and your specialty blocks. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please return. Please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you very much.